Johnny, I don't know about you, but to say that I am absolutely furious with the way these contract talks have been going for the MLB lockout would be the understatement of the year. I mean, look, let's be real. You and I both knew that this was imminent back in, like, say 2020 when they had to, like, delay the season because of all the COVID stuff. We knew back then that there were problems, but for them to wait it out until, like, March to even discuss the fact that there was a problem with the CBA, that does not sit too well with me at all. And Johnny, let me hear your take on this.
Yeah, Hank, I think you said it best there. We really could just flash back to the COVID year of 2020 and the way that those negotiations were handled when they could not even negotiate functionally that year to even get a 60 game season, in the middle of a pandemic when a lot of the country was struggling and really needed something to, forget about it. And these guys were complaining that they wanted their full salaries. And the way that that was whole handled, you look back then, and that was just a precursor of this past week. And like you said, I'm livid. It's now been over 24 hours since the news broke when Manfred came out and announced that the first two series of the year have been canceled. I'm still, I'm glad we didn't do the show yesterday because I think right on the spot there, I would have been blown to smithereens. And granted, 24 plus hours later, I don't feel much better, but I also don't feel surprised about it either. Like I said, because this has now been 2 years plus in the making. I just wish, there's so many things to talk about with this, whether it's been the optics, whether it's been, people will choose a side. They'll choose, the owner's side or the player's side or Manfred's side or whatnot. I blame them all because, this comes down to, these guys just, the way it was all handled, 42 days after the season, you wait to finally put an offer out and negotiate and stuff like that. And then you hold off until the week that spring training games were going to start to actually have meetings. And then you go down to Florida and have these meetings and you don't show any sign of desperation until maybe the last day. You don't show any sign of desperation really until the week that spring training games were supposed to start. And you wait until the day of the actual first deadline to have a marathon session. I mean, you can't be surprised that we're at this. And I don't think this is going to get better. The first week of games being canceled, that's if they go to the negotiating table tomorrow and actually hammer out a deal. And the only thing that these two sides agreed on were things that are going to alter the game forever. Universal DH, expanded playoff, draft lottery, the draft lottery for teams that tank. I mean, it's awful. Nothing baseball wise that's really legitimate really came out of these. And I think that these sides, they can't agree on what the sky color is. You think they're going to agree on this stuff? I think this is only going to get worse. I think if you're playing baseball by May, you'd be fortunate. But I've said this before. I'll say it to you and to this audience. Even if these guys agreed on a deal and we were playing a full 162 game season this year, the damage to the sport is done. And that's not even to talk about the stuff that's on the field, whether it's, all these rule changes, the way the game is played now, the dreaded A word that's not only taken over baseball, but in some ways almost all of sports, analytics. It's awful. It's frustrating. It's depressing. I'm glad we're here to talk about it because it makes it feel a little bit better that we can at least talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, it hurts that much more, Hank. Yes.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And believe me, I think when you really look at the whole tenure of Rob Manfred, it's not that surprising to see why baseball has reached the point that it's reached. I can give you a list of things, probably on more than two hands, of all the wrong things that Rob Manfred has done. I mean, it's bad enough that since he's become commissioner, he really hasn't done enough to grow the game of baseball. And I mean, look, I get it. People have their problems with baseball. It's a slow sport. It's too boring. Yada, yada, yada. Well, if you really look past it, baseball is one of those games that is pretty special. And you really read between the lines, it's a lot of fun to watch. Like, yeah, maybe it is slow, but you know what? At the end of the day, you're guaranteed a winner and a loser. It's a different sport than usual because the defense has the ball. There is no game clock. And you know what? Maybe that's not necessarily such a bad thing. I just think you have to really look in. I think baseball is a sport that really can be appreciated, but this is a guy that hasn't really done such a great job, like allowing the game to grow. Like I could talk about the way that games are streamed, like, but that's like a whole different tangent. But like at the end of the day, you don't see a lot of stars marketed, and with all that factored in, I think that's probably another reason why this game is gonna suffer a lot of irreparable damage. And not to mention, this is the same guy who completely botched the handling of the Houston Astros a year before all the talks happened. This guy, like, didn't really, regardless of where your status is about what he did in the punishments of the Houston Astros, him calling the World Series trophy a piece of tin, what a joke.
Absolutely. That Astros scandal is going to haunt him for the rest of his tenure as commissioner. And you made another great point about the marketing. I mean, you have Mike Trout, who's been one of the best players in the sport. I mean, he came out with an Instagram post today. It was the most that we had talked about, that I had heard about Mike Trout in years. And, you know, you have a player also in LA, same thing. West Coast, I understand. For us on the East Coast, that's difficult for us to stay up that late and watch a West Coast baseball game. But you have Mike Trout, who's a great player. I know he's been hampered by injuries, but when he was out there, he was putting up unbelievable numbers. You have a two-way player in Shohei Ohtani, who is one of the best stories, not only in baseball, but in sports for what he could do. And nobody's really hearing much about him unless, you know, you have that story from ESPN with Stephen A. Smith, or if you're a big video game person and you realize that Shohei Ohtani is going to be on the face of MLB 22 The Show this year, that's how you know about him. And also, if you want a full 162 game season, folks, go play MLB 22 The Show, because that's the only way you're going to get a full season this year. But yeah, the marketing has been bad. These rule changes that they've made to the game, whether it's to try and speed up the game, which is not really working at all.
The pitch clock does nothing.
And it hasn't been implemented yet, really? I mean, I've heard about it in the minor leagues, and I've heard about them talking it in the major leagues, but they keep talking about that, but that's not going to really do anything. You know, limiting the amount of times that a manager or a pitching coach or a coach in general can visit the mound, that's not going to do anything. Then he was talking about in his press conference yesterday, he was talking about how they were trying to talk about eliminating the shift. You don't eliminate the shift. If you don't ban the shift, beat it. I saw Joey Gallo. You know, here's a good story for the Yankee fan here. I saw Joey Gallo talk about the shift earlier last week, and he was talking about eliminating the shift. I'm like, Joey, your number one job in baseball is to get on base. It's not to hit a home run. And I get that these players are getting paid to hit home runs, which is a joke, and the players' salaries, that's a whole nother thing. But your number one job in baseball is to get on base. So if you bunt down the third baseline, if you go the other way when the shift is happening, you know what teams are going to do? They're not going to shift on you anymore, and that'll be a manual ban of the shift. Don't force and make it a rule that you could ban it. It's ridiculous. I mean, there's so many other things that we could do. You know, the extra inning rule, which is, you know, turn away the older generation of fans. There's so many things. And yeah, of course, you know, insulting the World Series trophy. And then you're talking about expanded playoffs. I mean, you want to play the World Series into the middle of November, you'll turn off the fan base, a ton of fans too, because by the middle of November, I'm sorry, everybody's focused on football.
Here's my thing with regard to the expanded playoffs. I never had a problem with the wild card game. Let's say I were like maybe 20, 30 years older than I am, and I was old enough to remember when the wild card was introduced in the mid 90s. I don't know that I would have had a problem because you only really would have added just a few extra teams and one extra round in the playoffs. You wouldn't really have like too many things going on. The wild card, I was a little skeptical at first, but you know what? It made me realize, at least then, teams still had to earn making the division series, because then the wild card game, is essentially a mystery box. I mean, you're either facing a team you match up well against, or you're doing doing really well during the season, and you have to face somebody else's ace, and poof, season's over, all because you couldn't win that division. I don't have a problem with the current playoff formatting of baseball. In fact, I would say the wild card format actually kind of grew on me, even though I will admit it is kind of unfair for that one team who won all those games only to have to play, like, say, an 83 win team that has, let's say, Max Scherzer. I'm not saying any team in particular. I'm just being hypothetical.
I get it.
But that's not a problem. But then once you reach 10 teams in the playoffs, overkill. Absolutely overkill. Because let's look at standings from years past. Let's say we started this whole like 12 team playoff in, say, 2014, 15, or 16. I can't remember who exactly it was, but I believe there was one year where there was a 79 win Angels team that would have qualified for the playoffs. Do you really want mediocre teams falling in the bottom in the playoffs? No, absolutely not. That's waters down the whole thing. Like, you play 162 games for a reason. Having 12 teams in the playoffs defeats the purpose of such a long regular season, in my opinion.
I agree, and I'll compare this to football for a moment. Look at this past year with the extra wild card teams that got into the playoffs in the NFL. And people were saying, oh well, we're going to have quantity, and quantity is going to be great. I think what you learned is quality is better than quantity. You're seeing that in the NFL. I think you're going to see that in college football, because they've talked for a couple of years now about expanding the college football playoff, and that has not happened. So those sports actually are prime examples of why you should not be expanding the playoffs, especially in a sport that's already in some ways too long at 162 games. And if you do expand, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to shorten these postseason series, or are you going to still keep the same series to the point, like I said, you're going to be playing the World Series in early to middle of November, and by then, if your team's not in it, you're on the NFL, because that's when the NFL really peaks, is in November. It's the month of decision. So that I can't believe that that's the one of the few areas that both sides were able to agree on, was they wanted expanded playoffs. Universal DH, look, that's something that I think was inevitable.
Yeah.
So, and I kind of don't have a problem with that. I do like the fact that it creates for more strategy with deciding if you need to pinch hit for the pitcher. But I get that these guys don't want pitchers to get hurt. I mean, you saw that with Jacob deGrom. I think it really goes back. Hank, this is a perfect example for us.
Oh,
it really
I know where you're going.
I think it goes back to the days of Chen Ming Wang.
June 2008, Yankees versus Astros. I remember that very well.
And you know what the crazy thing was about that is, after that injury, he never was the same pitcher ever again. So
yes,
I think it goes back to then, and they don't want these pitchers to get hurt. And look, if you have a great hitting pitcher, you know what? Stick him in the outfield or stick him as the DH. You could do that. So I think the universal DH, I actually don't really have much of a problem with that. That's actually one of the only things I think I agree on with everybody. But all this other stuff, I mean, the draft pick for teams that are tanking, look, I don't think in baseball teams tank. If you're bad, you're bad. If you have a bad pitching staff, you have a bad pitching staff. You're not tanking. I mean, like either the Baltimore Orioles or whoever else who have a bad pitching staff. I mean, if you're bad, you're bad. So I don't really know about that, but it's just between all that and then all these new stuff, and then all this stuff about analytics and now the way these guys pitch. I mean, they don't go complete games. The new thing now in baseball is forget pitch count. It's now they don't want these starting pitchers to go third time through the order. And I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but this is another thing I'm talking about that I have a major
Nope.
problem with baseball. If you mean to tell me that you're going to, let's say they even go back to the table tomorrow and they have an agreement, you're going to tell me that these guys are going to be able to ramp up in 4 weeks to the point where on opening day my starting pitcher is only going to be able to go 4 or 5 innings because he's not fully ramped up. The product is going to be affected on opening day. It's so bad. And it's just, I can continue to go on and on and on, but it's a broken record. It's been years in the making.
First off, I agree with a lot of your points. I want to add to your DH point. I know a lot of people go on and off of that. I feel like it really depends on what league your team is as to what side you're on for the designated hitter argument, but I'm going to straight up say this and take my Yankees fandom out of the equation for what I'm about to say. The universal DH was long overdue. I'm sorry. I know National League fans are going to cry and complain, oh, the pitcher's batting makes the NL more DH, yada, yada, yada. Did we forget that almost happened that this rule almost happened in the mid 80s and the early 90s? You're lucky you got to see guys like Jacob DeGroms, the Carlos Zambranos, heck, even Jason Marquis and Dontrelle Willis's hit grand slams or home runs in their careers. You're lucky you got to see some of these pitchers rake. This rule should have been like in place a while ago. And the reason I say that, imagine if the NFC and the AFC did kickoffs on different yard lines. Does that make sense? Why would you have two different rules for two different leagues when it's both Major League Baseball? This rule was long overdue. I'm totally fine with that. Everything else, I completely agree with you. Like, it's really, really ridiculous how, like, you have the whole reliance on analytics. And not to mention, there's also been that rule. I didn't even mention this in my Manfred, like, rule change thing. There's also the thing about the 3-batter minimum. I don't know about you, but I also hate that rule. It ruins the strategy of the Logie. You've heard of the Logie, right?
Yeah.
Left-handed, one-out guy, essentially.
Right.
Think Boone Logan, basically what Lucas Litke would have been had that rule not been in place.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And they think that that's a speed up. That's something that speeds up the game. It doesn't speed up the game.
It does not.
I mean, if anything, it's going to have these guys, put more men on base because they are not used to getting right-handed hitters out. I mean, there's very few days, the days of like Mike Stanton or anybody who can get lefties and righties out. Those guys are not around much anymore. And really, I have no problem, making all these different pitching changes and strategy. That was a rule that was also implemented thinking that it was going to speed up the game, and it's not. That was another rule that I just made no sense to me.
Another thing I want to talk about with regards to the MLB lockout, in no way am I saying that the players are completely innocent, because trust me, they're not. The Players Association agreed to a lot of the rules that led up to this year. They're by no means innocent. But to those who are on the outside looking in, can we stop pretending that this is an argument, that this is a whole war between billionaires versus millionaires? Have you looked at, for those of you who really think that, look at the salaries of a lot of the players. The Albert Pujols, the Mike Trouts, the Miguel Cabreras. Those are actually, contrary to the popular belief, just a fraction of like the rich guys in the MLB. More often than not, the average major leaguer will take some years paying off his dues, struggling in minor league baseball. And by the way, the pay in minor league baseball is terrible. Let me put that out there right now, because that's relevant to what I'm going to say.
Uh-huh.
After all that hard work, struggling in the minors, you get to the majors, and then maybe here and there you bounce in and out one way or another. And then after 5 or 6 years, you end up losing your place, and then you're out of the game after a while. You may have a 1-year, $1 million contract, but this isn't even including taxes and the amount of dues that guys are paying. So I feel bad for what the average player is who I generally feel bad for in this circumstance.
That's a very fair point. And you know what? I have a minor league team that's 15 minutes away from where I live, the Myrtle Beach Pelicans. And I always think about that when I go to one of their games. And you know what? If you want to go support that, this is your opportunity. Go support a minor league team. There was an Atlantic League team that announced earlier today that they actually are going to accept any tickets of games that are canceled, that you can exchange that ticket for one of their games. I have to look exactly. Somebody from the Atlantic League that announced that earlier this morning. So, and let's also be fair too here for just a moment. Let's talk about who the real losers in all this are. I mean, not only is it just the fans, but you know what? It's the employees, it's the people, it's the local restaurants and bars. And a lot of these places have still not really recovered from COVID back 3 years ago when, when these stadiums were empty. And then last year when they were still at either half capacity or whatnot, some of these places are still really struggling. And now those places are not going to be able to get, that opening day crowd or that crowd even in April, because, there are places that'll still sell out in April, like at Wrigley Field or Fenway Park.
Right.
They'll sell out in April because of the fans they have there. But it's, all the local businesses, it's the workers, it's, I'll even say this too, it's the broadcast teams, because some of these broadcast teams, that's what they do for a living. It's that one sport. I understand the play-by-play announcers, a lot of them do other sports and stuff, but it's them. It's the people that are covering the sport, because maybe that's the only sport that they cover, whether it's the newspaper, whether it's for TV, radio, newspaper, or whatnot. They lose in all of this. It's a lot of the local restaurants and stuff. They really lose in all this. Not only is it just us fans, but it's them. But maybe the two sides in Manfred don't realize that as they continue to act childish and go back and forth. They need to really grow up right now and realize what's happening, because this is going to take a while. I mean, Hank, you and I are Ranger fans. Hockey has a chance right now to really, take over the spot right here.
1-0, by the way.
What's that?
1-0, by the way, off topic.
I did. I saw that. Yep. You'll see us probably going to the TV a couple of times because our Rangers and our Knicks are playing. And you know what? I'll tell you right now, I'd be watching a spring training game tonight if it was on. So that's, again, Major League Baseball's loss for acting so childish and foolish for the past 3 years. So those sides that I was saying, though, I mean, those are the real losers as fans. And this is something that baseball, I mean, this is going to take, this is not an exaggeration. This is something that is going to take years for them to get over, because this is not just, it's a one-off lockout. Like, hockey might have come back stronger from that lockout they had in 2004, 2005. With baseball, though, this is the second time in 3 years that we're dealing with something like this. And I understand the first go-around was a pandemic, but it was also the way that was handled, the way they couldn't function a negotiation that year, the way they're functioning now, they couldn't negotiate here, the way they handled this stuff, plus all the on-the-field stuff and how everybody's being turned away by all this. This is going to take a very, very long time for Major League Baseball to recover from.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like
let's be honest, America's pastime, it's no longer baseball. It's football.
Yeah. And
what we used to do in baseball, even in New York, being able to talk, Yankees and Mets 24/7, 365, those days are gone. And they're going to be, if they're not gone already, they're going to be gone. And they're going to be replaced by talking Giants and Jets 24/7, 365, and that's with two teams that have been two of the worst teams in football the last several years. And that pains me to say that as a Giants fan, but that's the truth. But we could spend an hour today talking about how with their Daniel Jones or Saquon Barkley's future, the fact that the Giants cut Devontae Booker, which I know you and I spoke about pregame, and I'm a little bummed about that, but I understood why. I mean, we could spend a whole hour on that versus talking about baseball. That's just, the reality of the times right now, and that's what baseball has to realize. I don't think those two sides realize how damaging this is actually happening to their sport.
And again, like I said at the beginning, if you really think about it, this all could have been avoided even before the pandemic started, because, as I said, and Selig had his flaws too, by the way. I just want to point that out.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just looking at Manfred's entire tenure. And I'm going to list off some other things he did because, like I said, it all connects.
Yeah.
This guy, this is the same commissioner that tried to cut 40 minor league teams. So that's another example of how he is somebody who just cannot grow the game. And he also had the nerve to blame Mike Trout for not marketing the game enough. Bruh, you're the commissioner.
You're the
I mean,
commissioner.
look, I don't want to hear anybody say, "Oh, Mike Trout plays for the Angels." That's not a big enough market. First of all, it may not be the Dodgers, but they still market themselves as Los Angeles, and
Sure.
Anaheim is still a big part of Southern California, so that is a pretty big market.
Mhm.
Second of all, Ken Griffey played for quote unquote small markets such as Seattle and Cincinnati. Like
Uh-huh.
that guy got marketed like heck, and he wasn't even on winning teams. And this when baseball was more popular. You mean to tell me that Mike Trout can't be marketed like that? I don't buy that for a single minute. And not to mention, this is also the same guy who what else did he do? He pretty much does nothing whenever scandals happen, and then he goes, "Oh, a lockout, losing a part of the season would be devastating to the sport." But I saw through that. I saw through that when he said that, by the way, because at the end of the day, we all know the commissioner's quote unquote job is to essentially to, side with the owners. And unfortunately, if you go way back to the last time that baseball had a lockout, I don't know if you've heard the story, but you've heard the name Fay Vincent, right?
Yes.
He, in my opinion, was the last good commissioner that Major League Baseball had. When baseball had a lockout, they were in a similar situation in 1990. He didn't care what the owners were doing. He didn't care how much things would hurt them. He made them get a season done, and they got a season in 1990. And then after a few years, a lot of the owners, mostly it was like the small to middle market guys, got upset. They didn't like what he was doing. They essentially voted him out. So in other words, he got fired for doing his job because he didn't want to appease the owners. So that's one way where I get why Rob Manfred is like siding with the owners. But at the same time, you look at everything else he's done, he is essentially slime.
Yeah.
And if baseball loses its popularity, if baseball becomes what people see boxing as, and it becomes a quote unquote dead sport. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm an outlier in this. I hosted a baseball show called Hitting for the Cycle this past season.
Yes.
I'm the type of fan that when it comes back, you'll probably see me go to the ballpark whenever I can at Yankee Stadium. Like, tickets are easily accessible on game days. People like me, they won't have to worry about because I'm an addict. And like, in a way, it kind of represents me because I'm a bit of an old soul and liking baseball a lot. So there's that. But what all his actions basically, like you said, cost a whole generation of fans. And I think that is an absolutely damn shame.
Yeah, it's cost the older generation, and you're trying to get the younger fans in. How are the younger fans gonna get into all this when they see the optics of what has transpired here? Not only just in the past, 9 days down in Florida, the 90+ days that this lockout has been going on for, the 3 years with COVID and all that. They look at all these optics, and it looks terrible. And part of it is because they were sold the fact that they were sold that this was going to get done. They were sold Monday night into Tuesday morning that they were close. But again, like I've said, what signs did it show that they were going to be close? And Manfred comes out and says, "Oh, now the first two series are canceled," and people will start thinking, "Oh, well, it's only going to be two series." Do you guys really think that they're going to get a deal done? That's this quick. It's two series if they go back to the table tomorrow and agree. And I would even tell you that there's a slight chance of that if they agreed on just one major item. That's not there. There's still no sign of that. And it should not be the fact that you're going in at 1 in the afternoon and leaving at 6 or 7 and having 10 to 15 minute meetings. That's not how it gets done. So I would be shocked. Do I think this full season is going to get canceled? I do not. But I would be surprised if we're playing baseball before May. I think May is the earliest because you have to remember too. Once there's an agreement, these guys have to go have the spring training and get games. Yeah, they could work out in minor complexes, but that's not the same way as ramping up in legitimate spring training games and stuff. So it's just there's no real positive or no real good sign that this is going to get any better. And imagine if there's I'll leave you with one other point here too, because I had heard about this too. Can you imagine if there's a lawsuit that gets involved in all this? You may be talking about the whole entire season getting canceled, and then that's, I've already said the damage is done, but you do that, and it just takes it to a whole nother level.
Yeah, I'm absolutely speechless. Personally, I don't know. I think May might be a little too generous. No offense, Johnny. I would love to agree with you about May. Part of me feels like it's either, actually, no, let me rephrase that. I would say more like maybe Memorial Day weekend or early June is what my prediction would be for when a season's going to be. But you know what? At this point, as much as I love the game, I'm going to be honest, with all that's happened from last year and the year before, my passion is kind of deteriorating just because it's okay, because of the way that Manfred's changing things, the way a lot of these players are treated. And like I said, I'm not talking about the Mike Trouts, the Miguel Cabreras, or the big guys.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the average Joes who don't get who, when they have the chance to get their big boy contract, they're already at year 6 or 7 and they're not a star and are pretty much have to go into real life, have to find a day job, and have to support their families. I'm talking about those guys.
Very, very, very fair. Yep.
And not to mention, you have the stadium workers. And by the way, fun fact, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I actually used to be one myself. I used to be a guest relations member for a year and a half at Yankee Stadium. Decent experience. And who knows, maybe I'll return to that. I would love to. I had a lot of good people that I worked with, but I also met a lot of those stadium workers in games that I've been to in years past. I feel bad for them, probably more so than the players themselves. Not that those guys don't deserve sympathy, because trust me, they do. And I think that ultimately that's the reason why we're even in a lockout, because of the fact that, as I said, the idea that this whole argument is millionaires versus billionaires, it doesn't make, if you really read into the whole thing, you'll see why that argument, nothing could be further from the truth. It's a ridiculous take to make, but in any event, it's sickened me. And when it does come back, I'm going to be honest, even though I'll probably eventually return to a game at Yankee Stadium, even though I'll eventually bring back hitting for the cycle, it's also going to take me a little bit to for me to get my full baseball mojo back. But
yeah,
then again, at the end of the day, at least I have other interests.
Absolutely. And here's a good question. I'll ask you this. So when COVID hit, when that COVID year happened back in 2020, how long did it take for you to get excited? Because I'll be honest with you, I didn't really get excited until the playoffs had happened. It was so awkward seeing the Yankees and the Rays out there in San Diego, but it took until then to actually get really excited about it again. And then, of course, you know what happens there. But then when they start having a few fans in Texas, I mean, it felt a little bit better. But that whole year in general, I couldn't get into the regular season. And even the postseason, you're watching it, but it's not as, it's still not like how you feel. I feel like we're going to be going through this all over again if it does come back at some point this year.
I was watching every game that year because, like I said, I may have been upset, but at the end of the day, remember, I'm an addict at the end of the day. But at the same time, if I told you that it was easy for me to just get right back into the swing of things, pun intended, because baseball.
Pun intended. I like what you did there. Yeah.
If I told you that I watched but was fully able to get right into the swing of things, then that's a lie, because You had empty stands, the runner on second base. Like it just felt like I was watching something completely different. And then even into the playoffs, like it was exciting to watch the Yankees, but at the end of the day, like not to go on for a little tangent, but deep down, I knew the Yankees were going to end up losing a typical 1 or 2 run game because either you have the runner on second and third. What do? Do we try to get him up, get him in, get him over? Nope. Let's swing for the fences, strike out, series over.
Sure.
Every single fucking Yankee team the past 5 years. Excuse my French. Sorry. But yeah, no, it took me a bit of time. It was really tough to watch. And to be honest, I was actually a little bit relieved when the Yankee season ended because I was like, okay, well, at least we don't have to hear the chatter of, oh, Mickey Mouse championship. And now if we get a season again, we're going to possibly hear that whole thing. If the Yankees somehow actually hit in the clutch for once, you know?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. That's kind of like where I go. That's kind of like where I am with it too right now. So I don't think you're going to hear anything for a little while because, like I've said, these two sides they're not really close on anything. They're going to go back. I guess word is they're going to go back and meet in New York or negotiate against. They can negotiate as early as tomorrow. Whether anything really does happen, it's hard to say. It really is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.